Welcome, and thanks for joining us on this month's edition of Inversant Insights. Now, our topic today is a bit of a doozy in how to create equitable learning environments. We're promoting equity in colleges and universities. I'm Heidi Hancock, CEO of Inversant, and I'm joining you from Boston, where today it's a little overcast, somewhat cold, but very much early summer for Boston. And as you're coming in, let us know where you're located at and what the weather is like there today. In a moment, I'm going to bring on our esteemed panel of guests where we'll talk about equity in educational institution learning environments. And more than that, specifically how colleges and universities can choose to embrace the unique backgrounds, identities, and experiences that their individual students bring to the table. So let's say hello to our guests. Keith Harmon is the director of the Meyerhoff Scholars Program at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Hi, Keith.
Good morning, Heidi. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. I'm glad that you're here with us today.
Thank you.
Richard Harris is the Assistant Dean, Academic Scholarship, Mentoring, and Outreach Director of the Northeastern University Program in Multicultural Engineering. Hello, Richard. And don't forget to take yourself off mute.
I said I'm glad to be here, but I apologize. I know what you had to use for my title is a bit of a mouthful, but I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really intrigued by multicultural engineering. And, as we think about engineering, as we go through the different kind of phases of our post-COVID world, that's going to be an important piece. So I'm going to be intrigued to hear more.
Definitely.
Lori Lennon is a science journalist and the founder and CEO of Thinkubator Media. Welcome, Lori.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
And Laney Strange is the Associate Teaching Professor, Northeastern University of Khoury College of Computer Sciences. Glad to have you, Laney.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. And actually, I have a mouthful title too that is not real until July 1st, but I'm the Director of Broadening Participation in Computing now. So
wow.
I'm like a little part of the discussion too, all relevant to what we're doing today.
Excellent. Well, congratulations on the additional string of words in your upcoming title. And thank you all for joining us on Insights. I'm really looking forward to diving into the background and perspectives on such an important topic. So let's get started. And we're going to break down from the very beginning and break down what does an equitable learning environment looks like. So we've got multiple different perspectives and different kinds of institutions. So let's start with Keith. How do you view an equitable learning environment?
So I think it's terribly important, Heidi, that we look at strengths. There's a lot of conversation about strength-based approaches, and I think we need to always be mindful of the strengths that individuals have and also the challenges that they have. I think sometimes we focus too much on strengths, and we need to remember that there's balance, right? And everyone has strengths and everyone has challenges. And then we all carry identities, right? And that's terribly important. So I think an equitable learning environment is mindful of these and takes those into consideration as it structures itself for those who participate in it.
Thank you. I mean, it's such a wide topic. So tell me a little bit from your perspective, Richard, what does an equitable learning environment look like?
Sure. I think an equitable learning environment really takes into account a systems approach where it looks at the holistic needs of the student, the holistic needs of the system as it relates to faculty as well as staff who need to develop the cultural competencies in order to be able to meet students where they are and identify students from an asset-based model as opposed to a deficit-based model. And then realizing that one size does not fit all, and providing the kind of dedicated equity-based resources as opposed to assuming that a distribution of the same resources to every student somehow fits their needs, which is not the case. So to me, that's a way of kind of summarizing that equitable environment for the students as well as for the rest of the system, faculty, staff, and administrators.
Yeah, that's interesting. You've mentioned systems and you've identified a couple of different ones that we look at. And they are, one, sometimes not necessarily the first thing that you encounter when you're taking a systems or a thinking approach. And so identifying the multiple systems that are at play is particularly helpful. And you also used an interesting word, which was distribution. And I think of what we've been through with the pandemic and what we're going through right now with different kinds of redistributions. A wealth redistribution is certainly one of them that we're queued up to be undertaking. So that will be interesting to understand and talk a little bit about some of those different distributions across the systems. Lori, tell me a little bit about what you see as an equitable learning environment. Oh, don't forget to take yourself off mute.
Sorry about that. I would definitely echo what Richard and Keith were saying, where, for a long time, we've kind of been operating with like a single mold model in terms of how we're delivering education and how we're supporting our faculty and staff and postgrads and postdocs. And so, if we start looking at, all the considerations that people have and need when they are learning and when they are part of an education model, I think that's a really great way to start kind of diversifying the way that we are delivering education to students.
Thank you. Yeah. And so, it's kind of interesting. Sometimes we use the word systems interchangeably with models, but I think in this context, it may be a little bit of a different approach. That's going to be an interesting thing to compare models versus systems. Tell me, Laney, what's your view and perspectives on an equitable learning environment?
Yeah, I think that's a really great first question to start with. And I really appreciated what Richard and Keith and Lori were all saying. I thought those were all really great pieces of the conversation. For me, when I think about an equitable classroom, whether it's my college classroom or workshops that I do for girls and women, I always try to think about, in terms of equity, like what's the student experience going to be? What's the students going to feel and experience coming through my classroom? And here's what I always go for. I always want to think about an equitable classroom as somewhere where a student can come in, especially to an intro class. And if they decide not to major in computer science, which is my field, that's okay. You don't have to major in it. It doesn't have to be your career path. It doesn't have to be your favorite thing ever. But if you say no, thank you, then you should reject computer science on its merits and not because you felt unwelcome. That's what I want everyone to be able to do, is make that decision about what they want to study, what they want to do, what they like, what they don't like on the thing itself, and not because they felt like they didn't belong.
And I think belonging is an interesting part. I mean, we talked a little bit, or you mentioned, Keith, you talked about identities in the beginning, and then Lori or Laney, what you're speaking about is how do you create that identity, or how do you identify as you go through. I'm kind of curious, from everybody's perspective, having been through the pandemic, and I know in our program in Inversant, we're really identifying some of the different success metrics on how do we, encourage people to continue to save, to continue to access education, to be successful in their pursuit of their educational goals. But by creating that identity, whether it's college bound or whether it's a specific program, is an important part of that success. How do you guys look at the changes that the pandemic has instituted on the creation of an identity, and how is that affecting your work? And I know that was a big question, and so I'll roll it out again once, piece by piece, so that we don't all overcome each other. So, Lori, why don't we just start from your perspective, as you're looking at a wide perspective, different kinds of sciences?
Yeah, well, I will say my company is founded on supporting women in science. And one of the things that I did during the pandemic was reach out to women across the country and ask them, what is it like being a woman in science? What are your struggles? What are the pain points you're feeling? And it was an interesting time to do that outreach, because a lot of the pain points that women were facing as scientists were just compounded because of the pandemic. And I think the biggest takeaway for me, and it applies not only to faculty, but it also to students, is that, in my case, when I'm focusing on women in science, the way that women and girls need to be supported can and oftentimes is different than their male counterparts. So, I take that and I think about, what kind of supports are we offering that need to be changed or need to be looked at or amended because of what we've seen through this pandemic. And I'm interested to see what happens when students and faculty go back. I've seen different models where it's like, we're just going to go back to normal, or there are some institutions that are taking what they've learned through the pandemic and kind of bringing it back to how they start delivering, content or actually just supporting the people that work within their institution.
Yeah, interesting. So, I mean, you talked a little bit about some gender. So we've got systems of gender that also institute difference in identity and how it is that we're approaching institutions. And I love to hear, too, I know in our organization, the effects that the pandemic had on us and how we deliver and how we think about engaging our communities is something that we are taking forward and has fundamentally changed how we look at what we do and how we're going about doing it, of course, in a changing world. So, it's delightful to hear that there is a good cohort of institutions that are taking those practices forward into the future. So, Keith, tell me a little bit about your perspective on identity and how does that affect, having gone through the pandemic, what are you seeing changes in how identities are coming into play?
Sure, Heidi. I think one of the key deliverables or benefits of being in the Meyerhoff Scholars Program, I often tell folks, we help students, we coach and guide them through developing a STEM identity for themselves. And that identity is often developed in those experiential learning opportunities, in their research lab experiences. And the pandemic sort of gave a halt to a lot of research activity. Students weren't able to travel and go away for the summer internships last year. That's opened up a bit this year in 2021, so we're happy to see that. And labs on campus have also opened up. But in general, Meyerhoff students are required to work in labs over the summer. And I'd say beginning in their sophomore year, a majority of them begin working in labs on campus or somewhere in Baltimore in what we call the sustained research experience. And those experiences are terribly important in helping that identity development and being in space. Also in our 6-week summer bridge program, we usually would hop on buses and we go to Hopkins and we go to NIST and we go to the NIH and we go to NASA and we go to Northrop Grumman, and they get to see scientists and engineers in theater and get a sense of what that looks like and feels like. And we didn't have those experiences. But we pivot and we make the best of what we have. And so, wonderful technologists have given us, web capabilities. And so one of the great things to come out of the pandemic, I think, was it allowed us to stop and think, where can we find folks for our students to engage? And we have a tremendous alumni base. And folks who are in California and Arizona and New York who could not possibly make it to UMBC for an in-person event for Summer Bridge, of course, we could do that online. And so we had entrepreneurship. We had Meyerhoff alum who have PhDs and MD PhDs, and now who are in the entrepreneurship space professionally, and speaking to first-year students about, you should begin thinking about entrepreneurship and STEM right away. That's not something you think about later on. You need to look at the world, look at your interests, be mindful of what's happening. And so we were able to sort of help them develop new ideas for their identity as that developed. The program piece and the community aspect of Meyerhoff is so important. And so a lot pivoted online, near peer support, but I'd say the alumni mentorship was terribly important and filled a great void in terms of not being able to be in theater with scientists and engineers.
Well, so it's interesting to hear how the evolution of entrepreneurship is coming to play as far as identity in your program. And I'm kind of curious, Richard, from the multicultural engineering standpoint, I'm curious, how does that affect identity? And is that something that you're deliberately looking to build? And is that an engineering problem to solve, out of curiosity?
Sure. We look at the intentionality of identities and the intersectionality of identities as it relates to, gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, persons with disabilities, first gen, socioeconomically disadvantaged. And so we try to understand the full spectrum of the identity of the students in a way that then helps to build their space in a way that helps them to appreciate how they contribute as leaders in moving into STEM as it relates to the academic identity. We then realized, I think this year, and hopefully it unfortunately showcased the inequities, the disparities. We saw that in the health industry. We saw that in many ways in the economic indicators, but we also saw that in the higher ed and even in the K through 12 arena. And so depending on the resources that a student had, depending on whether or not they had the kind of quality access to internet service, whether or not they had to take care of younger siblings as a result of those siblings not being in school. And so they assumed the role of educator in those homes while still trying to pursue their own education. And so those were all the things that we were locked into and trying to find a way for them to hopefully address it in real time. And so as Keith mentioned, we did and do have a summer bridge program, and that summer bridge program helps to provide an early access point, develop a cohort relationship, create a critical mass that students can see themselves when they may not often see that critical mass when they step into the classroom, but know that they have a broader community that facilitates and supports their potential for success and ultimately achieving their full potential as it relates to the academic journey, knowing that that academic journey is connected to many aspects of their identity and how it doesn't have to be an either or proposition, but it doesn't have to be, again, at the expense of those other identities. And so for us, that's been a big part of what we were able to do with the Summer Bridge program. We ran this last year, 150 students, virtual Summer Bridge. We have been doing it for almost 18 years, as Keith mentioned, on the ground in person. And because of the experiences that we learned, we actually expanded it now from College of Engineering to College of Science. And then this year, for the first time, we will have a university-wide Summer Bridge, which will incorporate both STEM and non-STEM colleges, as well as access programs that students come through. And so that presents a broadening of helping us to understand, again, the unique identities that students have and how we need to prepare and provide a welcoming, belonging, but also supportive environment that just doesn't end and begin with Summer Bridge, but provides that wraparound. And I just want to note, because of that Summer Bridge experience, we produced the first Rhodes Scholar, African-American female in engineering through Summer Bridge. And then 2016 and in 2020, we did it again with another young female to become a Rhodes Scholar. So we know we have a model that works, and we optimized it most recently, again, going through this COVID experience with this virtual reality that students had to come through, which was stressful, but we were able to help many of them, and in fact, the majority of them sustain and thrive, not just survive.
Well, that was a huge accomplishment. You mentioned multiple identities kind of overlapping, and then you go through the question of, I must sacrifice one for the other, especially going through the pandemic. I mean, we saw that kind of just compilation of those different pieces and those different pressures. So that's great to hear that even through the pandemic that you were able to start to really look at how can you support people who are wearing those different identities and making sure that they don't have to conflict with each other, that they can be inter-supported. And so, Laney, you started this whole, question about talking about identities and coming through the pandemic. What kind of changes have you seen in your program as far as identity and the creation of that, and what kind of a role does that play in success?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I wanted to jump on what Richard and Keith were both talking about, Summer Bridge programs. And one of the programs that I'm involved in here at Northeastern is called SMASH. It's a national organization, and they have relationships with universities. And pre-pandemic, they bring high school students who are in underserved communities to live on a college campus for 5 weeks for 3 summers. And I think we were supposed to launch in summer of 2020. And of course, we on the Northeastern campus, and we launched virtual. And I think one of these things that we saw from the pandemic is that in a virtual classroom, I think you can, if you work really hard and everybody has internet access and also is not, doesn't have responsibilities at home and has the privilege of time and attention and broadband, you can convey course material. But that's only a part of what we do. And I think and that's true in any classroom. And I think part of what happened in SMASH, and I imagine in similar bridge programs, part of the experience, a big part of the experience when they come to be on campus is not just to learn the STEM material that we teach, but also to experience what it's like to be on a college campus, which many of them have not before. And they see people who look like them as their teachers and around campus as students, which is maybe something they haven't seen or experienced before. And they learn about, the process of applying to college which they may not have seen or experienced before. And those are all separate and different from conveying some particular course material, which can be done reasonably effectively online, I think. And I think that's true in any classroom. There's all these other components that's not just the material itself. And I think that's what the pandemic really brought to the fore, where we're really seeing, we can teach you this thing in computer science, but it's not the same experience. And I don't know what the outcome is going to be for those students who started with us in the summer of 2020. I hope that I know that the virtual experience was still good. It's as good as we could make it. Doesn't mean it's going to be the same thought process for them, the same experience for them when it comes to thinking about college and finishing the program. I don't know, and I think that's the part we're sort of have come to miss in the pandemic.
It's been a wild ride, and since we're talking about the pandemic, right, and the different kind of effects that has. One of the things, the pandemic really brought into quite stark focus the inequities in our learning experience. And we saw that students of color from low-income backgrounds and other vulnerable groups were less likely to have a positive educational experience. And we knew that was the case even before the pandemic, but that really highlighted that. It's only deepened it. So how do we close those gaps between those experiences, and how do we create a more equitable learning environment for all students? So, Richard, how is Northeastern University tackling this?
Yeah, let me first quote the late, great Dr. Charles Vest from MIT, former president of MIT. And he talked about the commitment has to be not from one aspect of society, but a multidimensional commitment from society. And so it's like the three-legged or four-legged stool. It has to be higher ed along with that K through 12 pathway. So that's one leg. It has to also include government engagement, and that typically comes through efforts and initiatives like the National Science Foundation, like the National Institutes of Health, like the National Academies of Engineering, and so forth. That's the second leg. Third leg would then be our corporate partners. In many ways, because Northeastern has this unique historical experiential learning model called co-op, it shows the intentionality of how we develop and nurture talent and then provide a pathway for that talent to be acquired by our corporate partners. And then last but not least is the community engagement. And so it's important that we find a way to bring all of those four in a way that not, diminishes one from the other or overemphasizes one from the other, but has that equal balance on that four-legged stool. One of the things that we've done at Northeastern, and you talked about why we call it multicultural engineering, is because we realized that we had to move away from the use of this term minority. And so whether we were talking about women as a minority class in terms of their representation, in terms of engineering, as well as underrepresented African Americans, Native Americans, indigenous peoples, Pacific Islanders, and so on, in addition to persons with disabilities, we realized that these are unique cultures. And so those cultural identities are important to be part and parcel to how we develop those students, to bring that with them and help them understand that diversity of identity brings about diversity of experiences, ultimately contributing to diversity of thought. And so we've been intentional in the way we design and develop these pathways within Northeastern, connecting to programs like NACME, developing STEM pathways for scholarship monies, providing opportunities like Keith mentioned about REUs, research experiences for undergraduates, and creating this holistic approach to help students understand that, yes, you can use this as a way to change your immediate family dynamic, but also impact the communities that you come from. And in many ways, students are empowered once they realize they can make change in their communities through the power of STEM. And that's an intentional model that we've developed within Northeastern across a broad spectrum, but especially within the STEM disciplines.
Well, that's really interesting to hear the focus on speaking with students about making change in the community and how they can have an impact. And that, that again takes a different kind of approach. It's interesting to hear the holistic, integrated, going back to the systems. We're not just individuals moving through a process. We are part of a larger systems and usually part of multiple systems. So that's really interesting. And we are STEM heavy here today on our panel. So talking about sciences and the different ways that we can approach that is kind of curious. I'm curious, Lori, from your perspective, I mean, you're coming from a different viewpoint. You've been through some other kinds of changes, and it's undoubtedly different as you talk and work with women in science. How do you see colleges and universities from a journalistic perspective making some of these changes?
Well, I think what I always see when I work with folks and part of the mission of really supporting women is I feel like fundamentally folks are interested in supporting people. But what I've found through like communicating with universities and institutions and also the women that I've worked with and have collaborated with is that a lot of times the problem is just really helping people understand what the problem is and getting them to a point to see that there's a way to a solution, right? So an example I had recently was I was talking with a corporation and they had said, we have a lot of leadership opportunities for people within our organization, but women never step up to take the roles. And there is a fundamental issue with that statement in that the question should really be, we have all of these leadership opportunities in our institution, but women aren't stepping up. What are we not doing to support them so that they feel empowered to step up and take on these roles? And so I think that when we're looking at addressing like gaps and making sure that people are supported in the ways that they need to, is that we need to get people to understand what the gap actually is, right? And then if we can kind of get to this consensus and understand that, and kind of figure out, bring people in who are experts in these areas to kind of help navigate and lead to change, I think is where we can be really effective. And in the work that I'm doing in supporting women, that's been I feel very honored to be able to have these conversations. And I get excited when I hear groups and organizations and institutions interested in learning more about how they can do this work. And I think like Rich and Keith have great examples where it's like they understand and they're constantly learning the landscape and what needs to be changed, and having that information is able to make the change, right? Because this isn't, it's like a living and breathing process. We're not trying to get to a finish line and once we do this we'll be finished. It's constantly being open and asking questions and continuing to grow as organizations and institutions and continuing to make people feel like they are part of the process.
I feel that's one of those long time life lessons that either I never come to terms with. It's not the destination, it is the journey, and this journey is constantly ongoing, and the destination just keeps moving on out. But I do love the point that you're making about shifting the framework. How are you asking the question differently to identify not the gap, but how what is the system that's in place and how is it not serving our overall goals? So it helps us restate what those goals are and then ask that question in a different way. Lori, how are as administrators and educators and science communicators, Keith, Richard, Laney, how do you see those questions? What kind of different questions would you urge us in our communities to be asking so that we can start to institute and close those equity gaps?
If I could jump in real quickly, and this is something that's come to mind. We didn't end up in this situation by chance, and in many cases, not by circumstance, but by design. And I think we need to acknowledge that if it was by design, we need to have an intentional level of how we challenge the prevailing status quo and what has brought us to this point by not developing all of our potential human capital to their full potential in order to maintain our global competitiveness, but also to provide society with an equitable level of distribution based on individual capacity, but also a collective impact. And so the questions have to be the hard questions. Just like Lori said, asking and challenging those organizations when they make a statement, while it may have been well-intended, it puts the onus on the individuals or the group that is already disadvantaged. And we oftentimes see that more so the case than not. And so again, moving from that model of how we lay blame, if you will, on those who have been subject to systemic racism, sexism, ageism, and we can look at all the isms and really putting the responsibility on the organizations that have the ability to bring about the change and then challenge themselves and be consistent in that. Lori talked about, this is not an end goal. There is no end goal. It is a continuously improving process. As an industrial engineer, I learned a long time ago working for a Japanese keiretsu, the importance of Kaizen, continuous improvement. And that exists at all levels throughout all layers. And that's important that we, again, have to ask those why questions, those hard why questions. Are we in this situation? Why does this condition exist? And therefore then come up with the solutions that could be multiple. There is no one solution, but we need to ask the hard questions in order to get to those multiple solutions.
Thank you. Yeah, asking. Yeah, exactly. We need to figure out the whys, and we need to be constantly asking them. Keith, Laney, what's your thoughts? Don't forget you're on mute.
I wanted to jump in on something Lori mentioned, where you were saying, in this situation, hey, we made opportunities of the same opportunities available to everybody, and women aren't applying, and that is equity, right? And that I'm grateful that conversation is not happening as much now as it used to, because that was absolutely the case, certainly in computer science. I feel like that, and this goes back to what Richard was saying as well. I think in computer science, we really for a long time have hung on to this myth that, because we're like rational and logical, we couldn't possibly have bias built into our system. We're scientists, like everything is just like black and white, totally fine. And this is something I encountered for a long time in industry and academia. I do feel like it's been changing recently, but I absolutely have heard, and I'm sure we all have so many times, like, and especially in industry in Silicon Valley, right? You go for an interview and you have to write code on the whiteboard, and it's like taking a test. And if you pass the test, you get hired. So it's fair to everybody. But never mind that, 25-year-old white guys wrote all of the questions and decide who passes and who doesn't pass. And for a long time, that was just not part of the conversation. Like, I treat everyone exactly the same. And so if you don't measure up, not my problem. And I think how that sort of becomes part of systemic bias, as Richard was saying, and that becomes the question that we need to ask, which is, why is it like this? Is it something that we have built in and assumed is fair when it's not? Because I think historically that's been a big problem in computer science.
I would just jump in and say, everything everyone said so far is wonderful and eloquently said. I think about, as Richard said, he mentioned the questions, right, which have to lead to some tough conversations. And I think the truth of it is there are folks who are afraid of the conversations. And I think we have to be honest about that, and we have to put that up front. Many of our campuses now have wonderful leaders who are experts and trained in this work. And I'm so glad we've arrived at the moment when they are being valued, as in the past when it wasn't always the case. But now their work and their expertise, I think, has more visibility and is being more valued in the academy. And I think that's really wonderful. And I think we also have to remember we have to have these conversations with grace and understanding that everyone's in different places, and that we all have learning to do. Implicit bias, we all have them. We all have work to do, and we all have learning to do. And we still need to listen. We need to listen to the experiences of everyone, right? The experiences of the students, the experience of faculty and staff, underrepresented populations. We need to do more listening, right, about the experiences of folks. I think we can't sort of move away from that. That has to be ongoing and continuous for this work to be long lasting. I'd like to just share one resource I think is really awesome. Howard Hughes Medical Institute, HHMI, has a new initiative, and it's entitled Driving Change. And it's designed to create lasting institutional culture change, right? And so they realize we're at this moment in higher ed. How can, and their questions, how can they help resource support institutions to create lasting cultural change? And so if you go to their website, there's some wonderful information there. They have created learning groups, institutions who put forth applications to come and gather and share their stories, to do some deep dives into data. And I think institutional data analytics has got to be a part of this understanding. We got to look at the numbers. We also have to understand the stories and the experiences. But there's a lot of information in the numbers there. And so if you could just take a look at that, I think that gives you some really wonderful experiences. And they plan on rolling this out and sharing it. And the goal is to help. Eventually, there will be a funding opportunity for many of the institutions who are involved to create initiatives that will create the lasting cultural change. But I think, again, they were so right in the beginning in setting up learning groups. But before we do this, we've got to learn. We got to stop and have conversations. We got to understand what have been the challenges, what have been the experiences, what are the resources on hand, what are the resources that we don't have, that we need, what are the voices that we need to bring into this. So I just wanted to share that.
Well, that's fascinating. Is your sense, I love to hear a disruptive approach. I mean, there's a system that's unidentified, that they're taking a specifically disruptive approach to turning that on its head. I'm kind of curious, is your sense that this is something that is directed to institutions of a particular scale or size?
So there are institutions of all sizes. And if you go to the website, they're listed. There are large flagship state institutions. There are some smaller private institutions. So they are covering the spectrum.
That's great. So you can be a small community neighborhood group that's interested in figuring out how do we make change in our area, or how do we, leverage a larger change across systems to become a model, as well as a large institution as far as figuring out. That's wonderful. That's really exciting. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So, and I'm kind of curious, Laney, we talked a little bit about isms, we talked about experiences. One of the things that not only just women in STEM, but we've also got ageism that happens, especially in STEM and in the computer sciences. I'm kind of curious, how do you guys see, again, the effect of the pandemic, or how are you specifically addressing some of those other kinds of experience that we're having?
Yeah, ageism is a really important point, certainly in technology. And I think one of the things that happened in the pandemic was that women were hit by unemployment harder than men. And mothers were staying at home to help their kids with online learning more than fathers. And what I think that really hits home, at least for me, is the way that we think about this is bringing people of all backgrounds and all ages into STEM, into computer science. So for me, I run a workshop that we call Women's Community of Code. And it's just like Saturday afternoon, you come in and you learn some code. And it was mostly for girls. And then I started hosting workshops for women. And during the pandemic, we went virtual, which is not as much fun, and you don't get to have pizza. And it was like not quite the same experience that I had always enjoyed. But I really felt strongly that we had to double down and we had to try to make it work, and even do more things like that, because women were hit so hard. And learning a new skill, or maybe finding or cultivating an interest in STEM, is not a panacea. It's not necessarily going to solve problems like that or address problems like that, but it gives you more opportunities. And that is something that I think we do need to make happen for women of all ages, because if you are someone who's had to stay home, look after your kid during the pandemic, and you're in your 40s and maybe you've worked in hospitality, which has been hit really hard, or maybe you work in the restaurant industry or retail has been hit really hard, having options in front of you can make a huge difference in how you can come back from situations.
Options is a part of equity, and it
Absolutely.
is, and that's a good point. Curious guys, what would you say that we have learned, and what do you see are some examples of important things that we want to carry forward, maybe from institutions like HBCUS and women's colleges, or programs like the Meyerhoff Scholars and NUPRIME. Lori, you've got a good, broad view of a lot of stuff that's happening in the industry. What would you say would be some of those rally points and things that we should be looking at as far as great examples?
Well, I think what we could do is, when we're looking at HBCUs and women's colleges, that there is a model that works, And it's a successful model, and wonderful people have come out of these institutions to do great things. So I think what we need to start doing is asking how that model works and trying to apply those kind of things into larger institutions that are more co-ed or more male heavy. I think we have something there. We just need folks to be curious and interested in trying to bring those things on. But I think the programs that like Keith and Richard are doing are doing just that. So, I would definitely defer to them in terms of like what they see as these models being helpful for larger institutions.
If I could jump in, and I don't want to take over, talking too long. I used to get in trouble for that in kindergarten as well. Having said that, I think one of the things that we've been able to do at Northeastern is, as mentioned by Keith, look at some of these scholarship funding opportunities. And in the case of scholarships for STEM, that is afforded by the National Science Foundation to both award students scholarship money to be able to afford attending an institution, but also has a research component connected to it to understand what are some of the best practices, as well as some of the unique innovations that can be developed. And so recently we launched what's called S-Power. We are finishing up our 5-year, $5 million program, but it was in partnership with HBCUs, HSIs, community colleges. And so the idea was to, again, be able to engage, interact, and facilitate a pathway that would support students either staying at those institutions, but having a pathway into a majority institution, in this case, Northeastern, where some of those other institutions didn't have engineering as a degreed program, so they could pursue it here and earn their bachelor's and go beyond. And so we've seen the success there, and the opportunity is to be able to institutionalize it, but then know that it has the ability to be replicated. And that replicability is what we try to bring to the arena, if you will, in sharing with partners in higher ed as to how we were able to, and what they might be doing that we can learn from as well. So I think those are opportunities that we try to build on, and that I think speaks to how we address learning from each other, some of those best practices, especially when we're talking about dedicated institutions for women, historically Black colleges, historically Spanish institutions, and tribal council university programs as well.
Heidi, I would just say, by training, I'm a classical pianist. It's a long story, but no one in my family was a classical pianist. And I remember going to college knowing that I had a passion and an ability and a talent for this thing, and I didn't quite know what the end would be. But my parents believed in me and affirmed me, and that's, they were like, this is what you want, like, we're going to do this, and we're going to make it happen. And what I remembered is my friends in graduate school used to make fun of me because I read the walls. I went to Indiana University for grad school. And one of my future housemates, they said, you're the guy that always is reading the wall. I said, I always felt like I didn't grow up in this. Like I don't know what's happening here. And I'm trying to understand everything that's out there, reading the room, reading the space. How does this work? And I take that sort of every day into my work in higher education and remind myself, we need to demystify higher education for students and for families, right? We bring them in every year, and there are all these unwritten rules and all of these unwritten sort of traditions and expectations. And we see the first year students sort of make foibles and bumps and bruises, and we stand and look at them and like, what's going on? Why are they doing? How would they know if we don't tell them, right? And so that's the thing about the Meyerhoff program, I think, that struck me. And, 22 years ago, when I started, I didn't expect to be here for 22 years, but it is a special experience. Working with students is a special experience. I sort of traded my music students for STEM students. But it is the thing that I love most about what we do, is that we demystify higher education and the expectations and how one constructs success for themselves. Many of our students who are challenged, many of the folks who fall out of STEM or fall away from STEM, step back from it, however you like to think of it, literally may have just not known what the expectations and the rules of engagement were. And I think higher ed in general, we've got to do a better job of that. I think we're doing that in the pandemic. I think it's helping. Our summer bridge program, Richard mentioned, I can't wait until this is over, and I need to connect more with Richard and Laney because I need to come up to Northeastern and read and learn about some things and bring my team and learn more about what you all are doing because it sounds awesome. These bridge programs, I think, are terribly important. Our alumni tell us that is their defining experience. This bridge program that demystifies the culture of higher education, that demystifies STEM, that creates, and we help them define a STEM identity for themselves, a Meyerhoff identity. And when that happens, people belong. And that's what the HBCUs are so successful because they have belonging. That those institutions are home, right? They call those schools home. And what I think predominantly white institutions, other minority serving institutions are learning and applying is those lessons of belonging are so important for everyone. Now, some have always felt like they belong, but everyone hasn't. We need to make everyone feel like this place is your home. You belong, and we affirm all of who you are and all of what you bring with you to this space. And then I think the other thing, just really quickly, is scale, right? Others across the nation have replicated the Meyerhoff model. At Penn State, at Berkeley, at Chapel Hill, at University of California, San Diego now, and many other places as well. And as we think about it, they've sort of taken on full-scale adaptation of all Meyerhoff components. Everyone's not able to do that. And at UMBC, we've even taken a look at some of the Meyerhoff components and thought, how can we scale a component for a segment of our population? Because everyone can't get the full program. They're expensive, they're time-consuming. And so we have a program at UMBC, and it's funded by NIH. It's the NIH STEM Build program. They're all over the country. There's another at Morgan here in Baltimore as well. And STEM Build at UMBC is looking at taking components of Meyerhoff and other successful initiatives and scaling them for hundreds and hundreds, for 500 students, for 700 students. And they intend to be institutionalized. And I think that's terribly important work that we need to think about. How can we provide more high impact experiences for students? How can we scale them? How can we institutionalize them? Because the students are coming looking for engaging, transformative experiences.
Keith, oh my God, you're welcome at Northeastern anytime. You need to come up here.
Road trip. Welcome to Boston.
We're coming. Thank you.
We just need to wrap in some West Coast, and then we'll cross the entire country, and we're going to change the whole system. I was listening to what you're talking about. I mean, so I'm hearing things like, we've got kind of something that we've been doing. We've been talking about bridge programs, but actually identifying just exactly how important that is. And Keith, I was listening to your language. You're talking about, and Rick, you're talking about demystifying. And when you referenced your background as a piano major, I was thinking about my background in theater. And one of the things that we would do, because again, we had to make people comfortable, had to make sure that they knew that they were welcome into the theatrical space and show them how to behave. It wasn't a terrible thing, and you weren't going to be embarrassed if you clapped at the wrong place. I mean, we go through those things. And so, I think about that demystification and how important that was, and that it required kind of a stepping back and recognizing that we had, clearly created an identified space or a process that we needed to talk about the rules of engagement and educate, so that we could welcome more people in, because it is about that shared experience at the end. So, I would take that forward, as one of the things that we would champion as we're thinking about kind of calls to action. And I'm going to ask this as an open question, but what would be, from your perspective, the one thing that you would ask us, people in our community, that we can do to make a change, that we should do in order to create these more equitable spaces in higher education institutions? What's your call to action that you would drive us home with? And I'm not going to call on anybody to start with. I'm going to do that to you guys.
I actually just wanted to jump on the last thing real quick first. Mm-hmm. Because I really appreciated what Keith was saying about the sense of belonging. And I think it goes back to, as well, what Richard was talking about before, that it's not by accident. Higher education has been mystified, and it's been developed a reputation and hidden in this reputation of being accessible only to a chosen few by design. I think that happens in science fields as well. I can't speak as much to other fields, but certainly in computer science, it has a reputation for being intimidating. And the people who are in it, some of them enjoy that reputation and try to contribute to it. And you have to get behind this door and I control the door. And I think part of demystifying that needs to happen is definitely higher education itself and how do we pay for it and whether it's a good idea or in a good fit for every person. But then also the study itself. Like we need to demystify what we study and what we learn as well. And I think the role that HBCUs and women's colleges play in that is huge. I went to a women's college for undergrad. I went to Simmons College, which is across the street from Northeastern. And what it really did for me was in the 4 years I was doing computer science there, I developed enough confidence and had enough support that then when I later found myself in the middle of, I went to grad school at Dartmouth, which is extremely white and male. And when I found myself there in the middle of this like crazy male dominated, white dominated, one female faculty member in the whole place kind of situation, I at least had 4 years of feeling like I knew what I was doing and feeling like it had been demystified so that when it felt more accessible, I had more to lean on. And I think that's a really important role that these kinds of summer bridge programs and HBCUs and women's colleges play.
Preparing and getting ready to do that. And, I want to back up from the last question that I asked you for the call to action, because what I want to do first is focus it in. Richard, you started to talk a little bit and you were leading into what is that cost? What is that risk of losing if we don't make these changes, if we don't start to make, these things in a much more rapid approach than we have been historically. So I'd like first, before we ask what's the call to action, let's put that into the framework of what are we losing if we don't? And again, I'm going to leave that open. Tell me your passion.
So I think the cost again is really the full development of all of our human capital. It doesn't always have to just come through STEM, but I came to this country from Honduras, Central America, at the age of 4. My mother had a 3rd grade education. My father might have had a 10th grade education. I just recently learned, reading through his obituary, that he actually earned his GED, which was an accomplishment here. And then being first in my family to go to college, first generation, and realizing that along the way, there were individuals who were invested in me. And that started, as Keith mentioned, within the family structure. But sometimes what happens is if there's dysfunctionality in the family, which there was in mine, there still was enough of a sense of the value proposition of education, of a means to an end, and still potentially being the so-called great equalizer. Obviously, it doesn't solve all of the problems, but it positions individuals to be able to have the critical thinking skills in order to become, contributors in a way that they might otherwise not have had the chance to develop those critical thinking skills, and how that then translates into maybe as a society, how we have the ability to think in a much higher order learning as it relates to our higher selves, as opposed to this lower self that we've somehow devolved into most recently. And I think that for me is part and parcel to what the value proposition is, that if we don't capitalize on developing all of our citizenry to their full potential as they define it, then I think we run the risk of devolving into a country that unfortunately is quickly going to be overtaken by other nations, and rightly so, who have oftentimes been considered third world, and no disrespect intended, because we're all third world, right? We're all the third planet from the sun. But there's always been this perception that we're the game, the game in town, we're the action, and we see that landscape is shifting quickly. And I think if we don't provide our citizenry with a real sense of the value of being a citizen of the world, but also being able to have the kind of critical thinking that is needed for us to sustain and grow and develop all of our resources here, human capital resources, then I think we stand the potential fate of seeing the decline of what has been this great American experience in democracy.
Thank you, Richard. You put it very succinctly. I mean, that is what is at risk. We are losing our identity as a nation. We are losing our ability to actually function. And I mean, you've talked about being subsumed by other identities, and I do believe that it is that significant. Thank you. All right, guys. So how are we going to stop this? What is the call to action? We're coming down close to time. So, bam, bam, bam. What can we do to stop this devolution into our lowest based self and the worst vision of a nation that we can be? So please, let's end on an activity note.
I'm sure we can solve this in the 5 minutes that we have. The thing I wanted to say in terms of a call to action is that, we've talked a lot today about systems and models, and those things are a really important part of the conversation. But I think for me, a call to action would be whoever is watching this is more on a human level. I think where we can make those kind of differences, if you're a student watching this, then you welcome someone else who you share a classroom with, or if you're a teacher, then you make an effort to pronounce your students' names and learn their pronouns and bring them into the classroom that way, or you make an effort to reach out to someone to apply to be a teaching assistant, who might be underrepresented, especially, is a really good thing to do. And I think it's those little things that make up the human experience that really change how someone experiences through and feels about their higher education or their field of study or their career.
Thank you. Being conscious of how your experience is affecting others' experiences, and being, recognizing that it's the collective experience that we're gaining or we're working through. Other heartfelt calls to action.
I'll say one real quick, and it may sound simplistic, and Frederick Douglass provided this on his deathbed, and it was three commitments: agitate, agitate, agitate. Because without agitation, change does not come of its own doing. And I think wherever you are in that journey as a student, agitate to get resources, agitate to find opportunities when they're not being made visibly available to you. The same holds true for parents who may oftentimes feel that the school system knows best or better than they may have a sense of what their child should be getting access and exposure to. Challenge that. And for those who are in positions of authority, especially those who are the educators, the teachers, those who influence the minds of those young people, and even those who are transitioning as elderly folks, if you will, into a different career, I think the important thing is to help those individuals develop the ability to know how they can agitate in order to bring about change, that it's an essential part of our identity as human beings, as Americans, to know that change is the only constant, but you can either be a victim of the change or you can be part of that change, driving it.
Wow.
Thank you.
It's awesome, both Richard and Laney. It's awesome. I would say personally, influence people where you are, right? Be a change agent in your personal space. Empower others, help them to be better, and see themselves as more than they can envision right now, and understand the landscape. I think in terms of an organization, Heidi, it's so important. We're in this moment, and I think everybody in the work, in our guts, there's this little gnawing feeling that wonders, when will there be an ebb in interest and in energy and in money and in resources and in visibility? We've got to hold each other and the institutions accountable for long-term change, right? And we have this moment, we've got to hang on to it, and we can't lose sight of that. It's got to be long-term change. And I think that's what we have to do, hold each other accountable for that.
Great.
And I think we could also make sure when we have leadership, we're asking who's in the room that's making the big decisions, and be sure that there's representation in those rooms, so that we are having, so that we're addressing everybody, right? Because we've been in this single mold structure for a really long time, and we need to break out of it. And the only way we're going to do that is that we're making sure. And I think, folks who have influence, you could do things like ask who's on the panel that you're going to be joining. Make sure that when you're a speaker, that there's a diverse group of people who are also contributing in that space. I think that's a really great way. And also, it's kind of like a bone I'd like to pick is that, a lot of times we like to check boxes with trainings, and the people who need the training aren't being trained, and what we need to do is make sure that the training we have is meaningful, and it's not just, let's host a workshop on how to be inclusive in the space, check a box, and let everyone go off on their own, right? And a lot of times, and I'll say this, a lot of the people that are doing the trainings, like if you're asking a woman, or like, for example, Black female scientists, there's like 150 in the entire country. And if you're asking one of those women to be part of a training and then also mentor all the girls that are looking to be physicists, you're burning these women out. So we really need to look at how we're running training and who's being a part of it.
We need to support, we need to resource, we need to agitate, we need to share. Thank you. So here we are we're in the middle of the revolution, but thank you for joining me, my revolutionary brothers and sisters. Thank you everybody who came to join us today, both live and on the replay. As always on Inversant Insights, there's a lot to uncover, discuss, and possibly disrupt when it comes to higher education. So thank you again, my wonderful panel of guests. If you haven't already, here's how you can connect with all of them. Keith, share with us how we can find and connect with you. Don't forget you're on mute.
I am muted. I'm available on email, kharmon@unbc.edu, at Twitter, Keith M. Harmon on Twitter. Yeah.
Thank you. Richard, what's the best location to find you?
Yeah, my email address at Northeastern University, ri.harris@northeastern.edu. And I'm also on LinkedIn, so you can always reach out to me that way as well.
And Lori, how can we find you best online?
My company's Thinkubator Media. I'm at Lori at Thinkubator Media, also on LinkedIn and all the social channels as well.
Thank you. And Laney, what's the best way to reach out to you?
Email is great. Laney S, Laneys at northeastern.edu. Also, if you just search my name, there's not that many of me out there. So you can find my webpage, Instagram, LinkedIn,
excellent,
Facebook, other things. I don't know.
And soon to have a new title. Wonderful. Congratulations. And I'm Heidi Hancock with Inversant. You can find me on our webpage at inversant.org. And until next month, keep up that good fight for more inclusive and equitable access to higher education. Join us at inversant.org to learn more about the people we serve and how you can get involved. We're going to see you soon. See you again soon. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you, Heidi. Thank you, everybody.